recording available on Moodle for people who, if they want to catch up with it, because I think they'll be, definitely be worth going over and revising. Okay, it's good. Some more people coming in. So welcome everybody who's sort of just come in. Thanks for attending. Um, and I'd really, as I mentioned in sort of emails to members of this class, let's really sort of make the most of Tom while we've got him. We've got him for about an hour, and then we'll carry on. And I've got a sort of editing kind of activity exercise type thing that I want to do with you. So yeah, really, if you've got any questions, it's really worth picking Tom's considerable brains about professional writing and about learning what we can from him about that. So I thought I'd just start with the sort of question that you ask me when I sort of guest in your, it was always an enjoyable experience to sort of guest on in your teaching. I say that Tom is also an academic based in Sofia, Bulgaria. But Tom is a teacher and an academic and a scholar in that sense as well. So yeah, I'll just to ask you, I suppose, just sort of tell us a little bit about the sort of writer that you are, the themes that and subjects that interest you, and yeah, just give us a sense of kind of your identity, I suppose, as a writer. First of all,
Yeah, yeah, sure. Thank you, Tom, and well, thank you very much for inviting me, obviously, and thank you so much for also. We've done these conversations with my students in Sofia, and they've been found them extraordinarily useful and positive. So I hope the same will happen today.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, I suppose because I now teach writing, you kind of think about, well, I ask myself, what do I do? You know, what, what does that mean? And I think, I don't know, well, as I say to my students here, really, I guess, everything I've done about my career has been to do with writing, and so that's why there's this kind of broad spectrum that you mentioned to do with it, because there is writing that I excuse me, that I do because I want to do it, because and perhaps that's where the poetry and the plays and the kind of what you would perhaps call more creative writing comes in. But at the same time, I thought, well, what I'm actually good at, and it seems for one reason or another, putting words together is kind of okay. I can do that. And so there's this other strand of my career, which has been a lot to do with writing journalism, and uh, editing other people's journalism. I mean, I was a sub-editor and an editor for many years. Um, and then now this kind of fate, as you mentioned, I mean, since our kind of engagement with Bulgaria, I've become a translator, which is a different kind of area, as it were. So it's mainly I mean, I find it quite difficult to know how to describe myself actually sometimes. It's like people say, so what do you do? And it's like, okay, well, I kind of write poetry. I've written some plays, and I am pretty much what you said, actually, Tom. I was a journalist for 30 odd years, probably more, editor of print magazines when we still had those lovely things. Um, for 15, 16, probably longer than that years, then had to make the switch to online. Uh, well, my employers at the time, I think they called it content management, which I think I made me want to vomit. But anyway, um, so it is quite difficult to define what I actually do and in that way. And but I find that really interesting because it's like um, in every situation where work is being considered, it's like, well, okay, what is this project? What am I actually doing? And um, and you mentioned travel writing, I think, and which is really because that's creative nonfiction, and that's somewhere between the two bits in a way, of like between writing fiction and writing journalism, and you know, I think I always have to say, well, I caught myself saying it on Friday. I teach a translation class here in Sofia, and I caught myself saying, I said, well, I don't know, one of the students asked me a question, and I just said, well, I think I can only answer that on a case by case basis. And I can't even remember what the question was, but it was just that seems to be my answer now to do with anything to do with writing is that you just have to look at it on a case by case basis. And, like, um, for example, to give you a practical thing in terms of, I'm aware this is about professional writing. So, most of my commissions now are to do with translation. And a Bulgarian poet got in touch with me a few weeks ago and commissioned me to translate his book of poems, which that's great, fantastic. I wasn't a poet I knew. Anyway, so sort of in my preliminary stages of work, I looked him up, obviously. I didn't know him personally. And he's like some huge scholar and philosopher. So I've now realized I've got to really up my game, to kind of do that. And that's what's happened. I mean, I like one of the famous, my most famous translation commissions is that I translated the autobiography of the very famous Bulgarian footballer, Hristo Stoichkov, who was part of the 1994 team when Bulgaria came third, fourth. God, I can't remember now. Anyway, in the World Cup, extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary event. And so, yeah, he published his autobiography here in Bulgaria, a huge bestseller. I mean, like everywhere. And when I was commissioned to translate it, I was scared to go out of of our apartment because I know I go past the shop where, Christo's face was in the window staring at me saying, what, well, you should go home. You've got a job. Come on, and it was really funny to be in that kind of really weird bestseller world. So yes, that's me. I don't know. I think on Facebook, I think my profile says Tom Phillips, citizen of nowhere and writer of things. So I think that pretty much sums up what I think about in answer to your question, I think, Tom.
That's great. I mean, that kind of, yeah. I mean, I couldn't think of a better sort of. It could almost be an epitaph sort of thing as well, couldn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Let's not get morbid and
Yeah,
fast
yeah.
forward
Well,
too
it's
much
coming,
time.
but yeah.
But no, that's great. That really, I think, yeah, that really kind of, yeah, that's a great little kind of praise, I think. Yeah. I mean, so that's interesting. Is I mean, I think the same with probably the same would go for people in this meeting. Students
Mm,
like for this particular module, they're expected to do quite a lot of sort of non-fiction, journalistic type
right.
writing, and that's the
Yeah.
focus. But in I know for a fact that there are people in this meeting that also write fiction and poetry and people doing, people very interested in kind of memoir and travel writing.
Mm,
So Given your sort of broad spectrum of writing that you've done and continue to do, which is really it's really exciting, I think. I mean, I think I'm the same, but I sometimes think it's
Mm,
some sort of attention deficit problem that I have where I can't just stick to, the idea of just doing the same kind of thing over and over again doesn't
mm,
appeal. But I wondered if you like when you sat down, for example, to sort of edit Stoichkov's
mm.
autobiography, were there kind of things that you'd learnt maybe as a poet or as a travel writer that kind of came into the decisions that you made about how to make this prose kind of more shapely and more exciting? Or, do you find that there's much overlap between the kind of skills required, what you do as a poet and what you do as a travel writer and what you do as a translator
Mm.
and how that kind of works, really?
No, absolutely, Tom. Again, I just think every type of writing that you do introduces you to or develops, depending on, uh, where you started from, uh, transferable skills. That's what I kind of think of it as. And so, for example, um, I teach occasionally, I teach non-fictional journalism courses and wherever, and I'll spend half an hour talking to students about poems. I say, yeah, look, see, you think poetry, I mean, apologies to anyone in this class who doesn't think this, but many people who come on creative writing courses or professional writing or whatever we call them, think that poetry is a bit weird and like somehow over there, like on another planet. Well, I think I obviously don't think that because I do that. I can wake up in the morning and I might be writing a poem or I might be writing a review of a play or a record or whatever, or I might be working on a piece of non-creative non-fiction, or I might be working on a piece of journalism. You know, I am also, I'm realistic about the need to make money. So, for many years I wrote about contactless technology, which is quite possibly the least poetic thing I've ever written about. This is for those who don't know, contactless technology is the thing in your bank card that allows you to make a contactless payment. And, to write about that every day for something like 5 years, I think I did that. Not all day, thankfully. But, it, and you kind of think, well, what's this got to do with writing? But, I just think the things you learn from all these different genres or whatever you want to call them, the forms or whatever, they all feed into each other. And so, for example, to go back to what I was saying about poetry, is that, I mean, I think the great thing about poetry is that it really focuses attention on what individual words are doing. And this is part of my philosophy, I think now. It's about like, what are words doing? When you write a sentence, what job are they doing? And so when you're writing a piece of journalism about, I don't know, some tech bro in California inventing some piece of nonsense that's probably going to bring down the end of civilization or whatever, you you kind of think, well, why did they describe it with this word? And should I use the same word, or which word should I use to describe that? And sort of just being aware that language is kind of floating on top of this vast ocean, to use a very cliched metaphor, but this vast ocean of connotation and meaning. I think so. On that, there's that sense, and then it works the other way too, because you say, well, here are the style guides or whatever for journalism, for whichever outlet you're working for, and they say this or that. And mostly they obviously want you to write something in the most efficient way. So how do you say uh, or sorry, communicate the information when you're writing a piece of journalism in the most efficient way? And then that can also help on the other side. It's like, oh, I've got this poem and it goes on for pages. Well, maybe there's a slightly more efficient way of doing that. Same with scripts. I mean, one story I always tell is I was commissioned to write a play when we were still living in Bristol. So this is over 10 years ago. Um, and I pitched this idea about the protests against the Bulgarian government at the time, which are going on here, which were not really, it was 2013, a lot of corruption. They appointed this guy who's effectively Bulgaria's Rupert Murdoch as like the head of national security. I mean, it makes, it's a kind of, makes some of Trump's appointments rather amusing. But anyway, so I got commissioned to write this play, and I can remember going, I was very lucky. It was very unusual. I mean, in theatre, you don't normally get to work with your director more than a few weeks in advance. You write your script and you take it to the theatre or the theatre company, and they say, yes, we'll do it. And then you'll be introduced to your director like a few weeks in advance. But in this case, I had 6 months working with the director. And he just kind of went, I took in the script, which looked like an old copy of the Yellow Pages. I mean, it was just like huge. And we just sat there and he was just crossing it out. I thought, yeah, you see, if I'd had my journalistic editor's head on while I was writing it, I would have known, I would have made those decisions myself. So this is what I mean. It's like this interplay between the ideas or the values or whatever you want to call them about what is good and effective writing, working in all these different fields, but perhaps in slightly different ways, I think.
No, that's really I think that's really good point. That sort of brevity and clarity and being,
Mm.
you using as few words to sort of express yourself. I think for me too, I felt like I turned a corner with my own writing when I realized the value of that. And it
Right.
could have happened earlier. I think I was, I wish it had happened earlier, and I kind of, it took a while for the penny to drop. So I think that's great. Um, we
Mm.
just to sort of focus on the kind of the journalism that
Mm.
you've done so much of and had such a lot of experience of. I mean, just thinking about sort of, I don't know, some of the obviously you've that's a really important skill that you need as a journalist to be succinct and like,
Mm.
I love that phrase, make every word does a job. I think that's a really great
Mm.
way of putting
Yeah.
it. But I was just thinking about sort of other, I don't know, other aspects of the kind of discipline that you need to get good at. And I suppose it's a way of asking you for some more advice about, being a good journalist. And I suppose maybe attached to that, or kind of a linked question, is that like something that I really spend a lot of time trying to kind of communicate and teach, not least to these poor guys here, is the sort of idea of the angle, of like what is going to
Mm.
be different and unique about a million journalists can write about the same topic, but presumably you have to do something that's unique and different and not derivative. So how do you sort of arrive at that? Is it something that becomes kind of more and more just almost like a reflex action that you're thinking like a journalist, or is it something that you still sit down and
Mm.
scratch your head over now, even after all these years of experience? Just be interested to know, how you kind of approach that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think, Tom, unfortunately, um, That's one of the answer is rather that both remains true. Um, there is a part of me that thinks, yes, okay, I need to find this angle, and I need to know what story I'm telling. I mean, that's the thing. I guess that's ultimately, sorry to go back a little bit, that's ultimately what links everything that I do is like thinking about what's the story. Um, and I've had that question from magazine, newspaper editors, and theatre directors. So it's common across the whole spectrum. But at the same time, I try to put that out of my head and, and just try and approach things without any kind of, what would you call it, preformed ideas and just say, right, I'm going to walk into this situation and see what happens. I mean, uh, here, I haven't written about it actually, but here in Bulgaria and in fact in the whole of the Balkans, whenever I've approached a situation, I've tried to um, just think, okay, I don't have any preconceived ideas about what's going on here. What is actually happening? And the example that's popped into my head is, well, about 10 years ago, probably even more, I first went to this most extraordinary event in the remotest part of northern Albania, which is called the Miss Mountains competition. And it just happened to be happening in the village next to the one where I was working. I was teaching English in northern Albania in a tiny village right on the Montenegrin border. And everyone said, "Oh, you must come to the Mist Mountain competition." I said, "Well, what is it?" And they said, "Well, it's a beauty contest." I said, "What? Come on." Like, what? This has survived in like the remotest corner of it. And it had, but it was the most extraordinary event. I mean, yes, there was a kind of competition, but it wasn't a beauty pageant in the way that, you know, Miss World or any of those absolutely dire things are made. It was like about how well you could embroider traditional Albanian aprons, for example. That was one of the major kind of criteria. And I just thought, yeah, because I approached it, but then it was really weird because then there was an old guy came out who's about 900 years old. I mean, he just was fantastic. And with a one-string lute, guzla, which is a traditional Albanian mountain lute. And he sat there, and I just thought, I mean, I don't speak Albanian very well, but I understand a little bit. And I was just sat there thinking, God, he is actually singing a oral history poem that started about 2000 years ago. It's like Homer kind of era. But I mean, he didn't sing the whole thing, which is probably a bit of a relief, really, because that would have gone on for quite a while. But towards the end, he was just like inserting recent political history. So there's a little bit about the Kosovan War in 1999, for example, which is about 12, 13 years before he was singing. Then there was another bit about what was going on in Albania now. And that was just extraordinary. And then, like, this kind of rap guy got up on stage and started rapping about how great America was, well, because that's how they were at that time. And I just thought, this is, if you could make judgments about this in advance. And you can think, well, it also, that to fill in the whole story, I should also say that there were lots of details which kind of went with or connected with those kind of assumptions that people have about this part of the world. You know, I on that day I went into the world's worst toilet, for example. I mean, you think the Scotland's worst toilet in Train Spotting, nowhere near, right? And you know, and there were lots of cliche. You could actually focus on the cliches if you wanted, but actually, what was going on was something completely different. So that's what I mean by this idea of, you know, when you approach a story as a journalist, you sort of have you want to find the angle, but I think the key thing is to find it, not to actually go in there thinking this is the angle. You know what I mean?
That's really really intriguing, and it feels like there was almost like once you met that guy that you had, you know, there was something there, there was a story there
Yeah,
that had to be told.
yeah.
So I suppose my question was like, who were you with? Is there some consideration? I mean, of course, I'm sure there is. You know, I mean, we know there is. But with that particular piece,
Mm.
you were writing for a particular audience or a particular publication, and therefore, did you have to think about, I don't know, sort of presenting it to? I mean, would it, like you mentioned about the? I was interested when you mentioned about the sort of potential for kind of these stereotypes about that part of
Yeah.
the world that maybe people not from that part of the world might have.
Mm.
And therefore, if you were writing for them rather than maybe people in Albania or that, you know, Eastern Europe
Mm.
or Southeastern Europe, would that have, would you have changed the sort of emphasis or changed anything about the story, or do you just have to stay true to kind of what the story you want to tell? I mean,
Yeah. No, that's a good question, Tom. I think, I mean, my instinctive reaction is to say, well, um, I wrote about that with the idea that the people I met there were reading it.
hmm,
Does that make sense? So
yeah,
it's like, okay, so the people back in who were most likely to read it, then they probably wouldn't even read the article, you know, like possibly because it was written in English and many of them spoke English, but I mean, I don't know whether they read anything in English. Um, and I thought more about them than about the audience,
hmm,
I think, or I'd like to think I I thought that
hmm,
because I think that I've written, you know, a lot of the stuff I've written about life around here, and when I've been, you know, one of the most scary experiences I had was I used to work at the BBC, uh, BBC Radio Bristol back in the 1980s, and have kept in touch with people who work there. And one of their journalists phoned me up because there was a hideous racist incident at a football match in Sofia. Um,
hmm.
this would be 6, 7 years ago. I mean, we've lived here for no, it must be 6 years ago. And and my friend phoned me up and said, "Could you give us a little interview on the phone about this incident?" And I can't even remember what the details are now, but I mean there are so many kind of contentions and you know hideous, especially where football is concerned. And I can remember sitting on our sofa, which is just over there, on my phone, thinking, you know, what do I say? Because on the one hand, I live here, and there are many friends of mine. And it's not to do with friends, but it's like, you know, it was a real question of balance because what had happened was absolutely appalling. It
Hmm.
was horrible. It was like a big football match at the National Stadium, and there'd been, I think it was a team visiting from England, which must be why the BBC were interested, because, yeah. And that's a whole other story. And there'd been some racist chanting, and it was really difficult to try and say in sort of at the same time, yes, this is appalling, but at the same time, not to justify in any way whatsoever, but to understand what was going on underneath, which was to do with the politics in the country, which had been sort of straying into a much more far right direction, and saying, well, I can see why that would sort of spew up in a football stadium when you've got this narrative going on. But, to try and explain that quite complex, well, it's not really complex. I mean, if you've got politicians in public view making racist comments, then idiots in a football stadium are obviously going to repeat it, like, because they think it means it's okay. But also trying to explain that in a way that's saying, look, not everyone in Bulgaria is like that. In fact, the vast majority of people aren't. You're sort of, I think when you're writing about another country, and you must know this yourself from your work, you have this kind of responsibility. And it's like, yeah, I could write endless pieces about how corrupt, racist, appalling bits of Romania are. Sorry, Bulgaria are. Well, the whole Balkans are. But that's only part of the story. And that's the challenge, I think, as a writer of journalism, especially when you're dealing with, kind of other countries, is to try and get across to people the complexity of it without sounding apologetic for the stuff which really is genuinely, bad.
Yeah, no, I think that again, that's a really good point. I mean, I suppose it could apply also to, I don't know if you were writing about your own
Yeah.
hometown or the UK or where, obviously there's always kind of nuance and complexity, isn't there? And
Mhm.
to sort of avoid that or miss that can be kind of catastrophic. I suppose you have to be very careful.
Mhm.
Um, I just want to go back to when you were an editor of
Yeah.
and your role, your kind of work as an editor of magazines and then later kind of online outlets. I just sort of wonder if you give us a sort of sense of like what it was like as a on a almost like day-to-day basis, like
Mhm.
how you would decide what. I mean, I know you so that content. What was the phrase you used? Content production or something, or content.
Content management.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's a pretty soulless kind of phrase, isn't it? But I mean, I suppose nonetheless, there has to be stuff in the publication, and the editor is the person who decides that. And I just wanted to give us a sense of like how you would kind of decide what stories to commission or what. I'm trying to
Yeah.
avoid using the word content, but basically what content would go into that.
No, I mean, absolutely. I'm more than happy. I mean, to give you the context, the actual magazine I worked on for, God, yeah, for most of my, well, for 19 years is Venue magazine in Bristol, was in Bristol and Bath. So it's like um time out for Bristol and Bath, or City Limits as it was in Manchester. We were all kind of in touch with each other. And it started as an independent magazine in 1982. And I came on board in about 1995, and I ended up being the editor of the whole magazine in early 2000s. Um, so just to give you an idea. So it was an arts and entertainment magazine, but with quite a history of being well, its main, I guess its main shtick was discovering new arts and entertainment. We were the first magazine to put Massive Attack on the cover. We were lucky. That was before my time, but also to do kind of quite investigative pieces. So there's a bit of private eye in there. There was a bit of, what I mean? It was kind of quite a mixed thing. And so when I was the editor, we'd been taken over by the local newspaper at the time, and they were quite hostile to us. We were well, they thought of us as hippies. We were the hippies in the room. Well, actually, we were really punks, which was a little bit, in a kind of subculture way, was a bit of a misidentification on their part. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. I just wanted to it was quite a difficult time, and we were going down in terms of sales and so on. So there was always that pressure on me as the editor to do something, and it wasn't quite sure what we should do, and so we always had that in the back of our minds, but the decisions came from, I think ultimately, I hope in my case, because I was under pressure from the advertising department. I mean, this is one of the things with working in magazine journalism that you don't realize until you get into it, is that you're under pressure from the advertising department because they want to sell ads. Then you're under pressure from the sales department, the distribution department, because they want to sell magazines. So in other words, the people who are actively marketing your journal rather than a magazine, rather than the ones who are attracting. And then you're under pressure from the design department because they want to put something cool and fab on the cover. So we'd have these really weird, and then you're also under pressure from the journalists who are, want to write something really interesting, and want to expose something or something. So it's a case of really trying to balance those different pressures. I mean, as an editor, in terms of what gets commissioned, but for practical terms, and I think this is maybe more useful for everyone here, is that one of the things that chiefly affected my decisions about what I commissioned was the quality of the proposal in the first place. There are so many people who would email me, and they'd address me as not only the last editor, i.e. the name of the last editor, but the one before that, or would send me work which had, or their proposal email had spelling mistakes. Well, we had a zero tolerance policy on that. I mean, my late great Doc, my closest friend, who was my fellow sub-editor, who sadly died early, we would just go into the pub and I just go, look at what I've had today. This person has proposed this article. They can't even spell the word article. Do you know what I mean? It's like those little moments of attention to detail are really important, because you've got to grab someone's attention. If you're a wannabe journalist, you have to do that. You have to make sure that it's absolutely, just on the surface, absolutely okay, because otherwise we're not going to bother. Why would we? I think that's the horrible truth.
That's crucial, isn't it? I think because it's sort of like if you can't be trusted to kind of spell, a quick email
Yeah.
right, then it doesn't bode well for the quality of the
Yeah.
final thing you're going to send, presumably, right? That's the way I would look at it. But no, that's great. So turning that sort of going to the other side of the equation, as it were,
Mm.
what kind of pitches would sort of grab you or stand out for you? I mean, was it something that would kind of have to fit this complicated agenda that you were, with the pressures from different departments?
Mm.
Um,
No, I'm really pleased to say, and this is a lot to do with the. I mean, I was working to uh, a guy who was known as the group editor. So we had a number of different titles in the group, and they were really open. I mean, Dave, so he's a good mate of mine. He was one of the early editors of the magazine back in the 80s.
hmm.
And so we had a really good working relationship. And I could talk to him and he'd just turn around and go, "No, Tom, that's absolute rubbish." But he'd also say, "No, that's brilliant." And the one example, and this is going to sound really weird, but I do have to tell this story because I think it illustrates um, how well, the world of journalism used to work on I guess I have to say, but also the way you can kind of get these brilliant ideas into print. And so this is a story which involves dogging. Um, and there was a very, very famous dogging site near Bath, which is where, Bristol and Bath is where the magazine covered. And I don't know why, but I had this idea that it would be a really good idea to send the visual art editor, terribly learned, terribly intellectual, to cover this story.
Tom, I hate to interrupt you. Hold that
Yeah.
thought. I'm just wondering whether we might need to explain dogging to our.
Oh, okay.
I'm just wondering if this is a I mean, I know what it is, not through personal experience, I hasten to
No, I know, of course.
add.
Anyway,
Um,
okay. It's
yeah. You don't.
casual,
I don't want to
sexual.
place that on you necessarily.
Yeah. Well,
But
no,
you,
I kind
yeah.
of developed quite a good argument. Well, quite a good way of it's casual sexual liaisons carried on in car parks. Um, that's basically what was going on. And
Dictionary
so I thought
definitions.
that sending the most intellectual, most aesthetic member of our kind of sort of freelance community to cover that would be a really good idea. And and so they went. And he wrote the most brilliant article, absolutely fantastic piece of writing. It's like one of the, I mean, it sounds like a really crazy thing, but I think it's probably the one of the things that I'm most proud
Mm.
of having published. And when it came out, there was an absolute furore. Like the local newspaper, I mean, like they put our magazine, the local newspaper that owned the magazine at that point also owned like most of the newsagents in independent, independent newspaper news agents in Bristol. And Venue magazine went on the top shelf, like alongside all the porn magazine. It was, and Dave, my sort of group editor, came back. I was really dreading because they went to a management meeting, a weekly management meeting, after it came out. And I was just dreading when he came back and he said, "I have never seen anything like it." It was just, and the wonderful thing about it was that it wasn't sensationalist. It wasn't pornography. It wasn't anything. It was like this guy just went and was completely honest. And he said, he didn't even say, I'm the art editor of Venue and I'm in this weird space. He just said, he wrote about what happened
Mm,
in a completely non-judgmental way.
mm,
And because he did it because these people were, I mean, from what he wrote, you think, "Oh, yeah, what are you up to? You know, you would be kind of quite, I think most people would find it quite disturbing or morally dubious.
mm,
But he was completely honest, as I say. And because of that, when
mm,
you read the article, you could have space for your own thoughts about it and thinking,
mm,
well, what is going on here? It's either some kind of horribly immoral, exploitative thing, or it's actually quite tragic, that people have to do this because that's the way that they feel that they're, I don't
mm,
know, what, fulfilled or whatever. So I thought that was a very good example of this idea of trying not to have an idea in advance of
mm.
of of a story when you're writing something journalistically, you know.
That's a really good example because like the subject matter would seem to be quite provocative in
Yeah,
order, that it would be hard not to come away without it, like you say, it sort of maybe taking the piss or, you
yeah,
know, making it sensational as you put
yeah.
it. That's
I
yeah,
mean,
judgment.
I tried to imagine what I remember at the time. It was kind of I had in my mind like what would the before I saw Steve's copy was like what would the Guardians say about this on the one hand, and then on the other it was just like what would the Daily Mail say about this? And I thought, well, actually, we said something completely different,
Yeah.
and without being necessary, well, not at all positive. I mean, I mean, ultimately, when I actually, funny enough, I was back in Britain earlier this year, and I found that magazine,
Hmm.
particular copy of the magazine, because
Hmm.
I'd obviously kept it like as a little kind of, and I read the article again, and I just thought, God, that was brilliant because actually, it is really sad, and it really makes you think about the stories of the people behind it.
Hmm.
And I think maybe that's something that journalism can do, which is unique, which is
Hmm.
make people think about the stories behind the people who are doing whatever they're doing,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know.
Great point. Yeah. I'm just wondering if do you have any questions from anyone? I mean, whether you want
Yeah.
to type one in the message box. We had some emojis to helpfully sort of illustrate what we were just talking about. The one of a dog and a car and a person. So thanks, Louis and Tim, for your
Oh,
contribution
yeah.
there. They're
Yes.
hieroglyphics
Well, that's
referring
perfectly
to.
right. If I can, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, Rebecca, did you want to? Yeah, did you have a
No,
question?
no, I just said thank you.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. Most welcome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, any questions for Tom about anything so far, or sort of comments that you might want to make, or anything, any advice you might want
Yeah.
from him? Um, oh,
Oh,
so
okay.
yeah, how did
How
you know
did
you
you know
want
you wanted to be a writer?
to?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll give you the that's a very good question, Lexi. And I'm asked it all the time when I'm teaching here. And I have to say, so I've thought about it quite a lot. And one is that I was brought up in a household which was slightly unusual, in that my father was an engineer. So he would do things like just dismantle the car and put everything on a sheet in the front garden so you could work out how it worked. So there's a very, very mechanical, scientific end to my upbringing. But my mother was very, very much into writing. I mean, I think I first read a Shakespeare play with her when I was about 10 years old, which is probably far too young for anyone to do that kind of thing. And there were books around and whatever. And it just, and then also she had a very, very good close friend who was a bookseller during the Second World War, and who was like my adopted great aunt, who sent me lots of books that I wouldn't have otherwise read, you know, at various ages in my life. I mean, she sent me Paul Theroux's The Great Railway Bazaar when I was about 11 and said, you should read this. I went, oh, okay. I ended up in Bulgaria, which is probably why, and so on. But then I don't know why, but the first reason that I knew I wanted to be a writer was that I realized it was a great way of showing off. It sounds very sort of negative, but mum and dad used to have little Christmas parties, you know, for their friends, and they were quite into amateur dramatics. And I don't know whether they asked me to write a poem or not, but I wrote this poem about Christmas and they said, you should read it. And I read it to all their adult friends, and I'm like 12 years old or whatever. And they all went, oh God, that's hilariously funny and blah, 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 blah. And so the first thing in answer to your question is a bit sort of shameful, really. It was just like, well, I can do this and it makes people laugh, and that's good. But it was later, I think, you know, when I was at university, perhaps, or perhaps when I took a year off and I lived in Australia for a while, and I didn't really understand what was happening in my life, and I think that's what it was. And then I started writing things, and people started to want to publish them quite when I was quite young, which was quite lucky. So I think that's where it came from. But you know, another honest answer to your question, Lexi, is like, I don't know what else I would have done. You know, it's like words have been there all the time. And it's just part of what I do, I guess.
That actually leads us, Tom, by the way, are you able to stay on a bit longer?
Yeah. No,
No,
I'm happy to
because
stay as long as.
it's my fault. I should have come in earlier and allowed people to ask questions, but we've got a flurry of quite good ones. And in fact, the next one
Yeah.
really neatly from Lexi's question. This is from Tim, which about how did you get your first works published? So we've got to that point in your kind of memoirs now. So yeah,
Yes.
perhaps tell us more about those early publications and
The early publication. Oh, right. No, that's a great question, Tim. I think, well, I got my first works published by sitting in the sixth form common room at the secondary school I went to with all the right people, and we decided we'd start a magazine. So you know, sorry, that sounds very facetious, but I think actually starting from that age, I was about 16, 17, and we were all, you know, there's about half a dozen of us, really interested in writing, really interested in what was going on at the time. This is like the 1980s. So there was like people like Alistair Gray, Jeanette Winterson, William S. Burroughs is still alive. You know, all that kind of stuff was really influencing us. And so we just decided, and there was punk rock, and you know, and like, well, if you can make an album, then you can publish a magazine. So that was how that happened. A little bit later, after university, I mean, again, the same thing kind of happened at university, made up magazine. We just made magazines together. and got our work published. And a little bit later, it was more to do with, well, I think actually sheer cheek. I think you just have to, well, this is how it worked for me. So, for example, my journalism career began because I thought, okay, here are some facts about me. I didn't think of them. These thoughts didn't form themselves in this way at the time, but now I can, this is how it was. One is I really like George Orwell. Okay. Two, Tribune newspaper still exists, for which he famously wrote. Three, I really like music. And so I wrote to the then editor of Tribune newspaper, Paul Anderson, and I sent him this kind of speculative music review. And this is all like way before internet. This is obviously, you had to wait for days for someone to send you a letter back, actual letter. And he said, yes, Tom, do you want to work for us? And it was just, that's why I say about sheer cheek. It was like, who am I? I was 23 years old. I like The Fall, or, The Clash or whatever. And I wrote to the editor of the newspaper that George Orwell, one of my heroes, used to work for, and just said, are you in need of a music reviewer? So it's really odd. And the whole relationship with Venue magazine that I was talking about began because I met their then theatre editor in the foyer of a theatre. And she said, you should write for us. I went, okay. Send me to review something. So, and also, I think I did quite a lot of academic journalism in the 90s with Contemporary Review, based in Oxford. And that again was just because absolute sheer cheek. So I think if you have a good proposal, and I don't know what the secret of that is, and once you've sort of shown an editor or that you can actually write what you say, what you promise, then it will go on from there, I think. So it's worth taking a chance, in other words, I think.
So in a way, that's quite a nice answer to Louis's question. How would you say is the best way to get noticed within the writing industry? Do you think that's I wonder if, like, obviously the industry's changed, and your career absolutely spanned that kind of move from the kind of analog world of publishing, talking about letters taking a while to come back and forth, and then into the digital era, which is I imagine most of the students in this meeting kind of they're digital natives sort of thing. So do you think there's anything different? I mean, what it seems like what you've said about kind of just having that kind of courage just to kind of send something off, that perhaps hasn't, that principle still stands, would you say? I mean, or
yeah. I mean, I think so, Tom. And I think one of the, like you say, I'm not a digital native. I'm a digital migrant in the sense that I've come to it later in life, and but I do think it's the same thing. I mean, I think there's a sort of problem that we all have as writers, which is to underestimate the quality of what we do, and we kind of think, oh, well, we can't do what this person is doing because they're famous and they've got, X million followers, or they've won this award or whatever. And one of the really nice things that I've learned here, living in Bulgaria, is that that's actually a sort of effectively gatekeeper construction thought, if that makes sense. You know, like that's what people want you to think. Whereas I found here that, again, which has kind of backed up this idea of just having, as you say, the courage or the cheek, whatever you want to call it, to try is worth it. You know, like, okay, I'm going to name drop appallingly, but, you know, Georgi Gospodinov is the most famous Bulgarian writer at the moment because he won the International Booker Prize with Angela Odell, his translator, who's also brilliant, a couple of years ago. I arrived here in Bulgaria, what, nearly 7, 8 years ago. And talk to them. And you know, it's like I felt really nervous because you know, they're both really eminent people. But now, I'm pleased, you know, I can quite happily email Georgi and ask him something, and Angela sends me work to do. You know, and it's complete cheek. It's like I came out of nowhere into the Bulgarian translation world, and yet they've welcomed me and they've been really fantastic. So I think, and the same is true of Paul Anderson back at Tribune way back in the 1980s. You know, he just said, I mean, I'm still in touch with Paul, and he said, it was just so great getting your letter. You know, so I think rather than the idea, and the reason I'm saying it, rather than the idea that you have to do something yourself, chuck it out online, get loads of followers, blah, 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 is, you know, that's not necessarily the right way to go, because then you're probably going to start being tempted to be more and more outrageous or whatever. Whereas, you know, maybe that's not the way to sort of learn to know what everyone else is doing and being able to assess what, oh, okay, this is a really interesting connection that I would like to make. This is the kind of writing I'd like to do. You know, I think the temptation with the digital world, in other words, is to kind of make a spectacle and go, hurrah, look at me. I've got loads of followers. You know, I'm not sure that's quite the right way to go about it.
I think this seems like a good question to end on from Haroon. And it kind of, and it again, it relates kind of quite nicely to kind of what people have asked already, which is, what do you think someone needs to become a great writer?
Oh,
speaking as a great writer yourself, Tom, I mean, come on, let's not, you know.
I'm not a great writer.
You are.
I'm a jobbing writer. I think that's well, okay. All right. I think, okay. So what I tell my students, Haroon, to be absolutely honest, is you need to be, first of all, you need to be a great reader. I don't mean in terms of volume or, you know, you don't have to be particularly widely read. I think you just you need to understand how to read other people's work as a writer. So, you know, for example, I'm reading Jose Saramago's novel Balthazar and Bleminda at the moment. And I have to say that I'm finding it rather hard going. But, you know, because it's written in tremendously long sentences, I don't know how good the translation from the Portuguese is or whatever. But sort of reading it, I kind of feel something a little bit more about, okay, this is the way I don't want to go. I want to go that way. So I think that's just a very odd and rather not quite thought through idea. But I think you do need to be a great writer. I think you also need to be a great observer. I'm becoming increasingly convinced that the way we look at the world, the way we see the world is very important. And like the ability to see the details and to not, and this goes to journalism as well, and I think the stories I've told this evening hopefully illustrate that. Not to see what everyone expects you to see, or what even yourself you expect to see, but to just look. I'm a huge fan, well, I think Tom is too, of psychogeography and the entire kind of philosophy behind that, which is just to go to places and look at them differently. I mean, I think that's probably a fair summation of it. So I think those two things, I think we very often focus on the actual use of words. And, oh gosh, I'm starting to, yes, I'm having a realization, I think, that we focus so much on the actual words that are used. And I know when I'm teaching, I'm encouraged to discourage my students from using cliches and so on. And that's actually important, obviously. But I think it's actually the way you avoid that is not by saying, well, you can't say, the sea is azure anymore, because everyone said that. It's actually, you have to see the sea in a different way. So I think it's slightly more, it's like going down a bit deeper. And I think that's what it takes to become a great writer. I mean, if you read things that people like Virginia Woolf or Hemingway or whatever have said, I think that's pretty much what they say too, I think.
Really good point. Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah,
But no, that's yeah, and I think you can see that in the great writers, whoever you admire, can't you? You can absolutely see that kind of thing, that kind of technique going on, definitely. So Rebecca has just come in with a late, and
yeah.
this is quite an interesting question. So have you ever encountered a brilliant yet controversial text that awed you with how brilliantly it opened up different concepts of politics and such like? But it was such a radical and appalling text that you also knew you couldn't show it to anyone. And then there's a sort of, I don't know if this is connected, what should a writer do if we make something brilliant yet heavily controversial yet unshareable? So I don't know, like maybe answer that how you like, really.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, and especially at the moment when we have the, censorship by the free speech advocates, which is just such a stupid, parodic position. We have that here in Bulgaria. You're not allowed to teach certain texts in schools, and I mentioned William S. Burroughs. He is the most, politically, ethically dubious person ever. But I think he's also brilliant, and he also tears at the absolute fabric of and the very foundations of
Sorry,
capitalism. Oh yeah, which text? Oh well, we're not allowed to. I don't teach in school, Rebecca, so I'm lucky. But any text which reference gay, bisexual, lesbian, LGBT texts are now banned in school.
do you think that the writers or the other activists are going to be able to lift this ban one day? I, I
Yeah,
think
I
it
mean, I
is.
hope so. Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
it is.
yeah,
It's
I'm,
very much counterproductive within these times that a lot of European countries are still not ready to face these modern concepts. I
yeah.
think it's
I mean,
it's rather dumb from them.
yeah, I would reassure you that the English language department at Sophia University, assuming this isn't being listened into by Putin or someone, I can assure you that we are absolutely hostile to this. Like we just teach absolutely everything, but unfortunately, students are having to get to our level, to university level, to access those texts now, and it's appalling, and
Thank
I
you
think
for the answer.
no, sorry, no.
I am sorry, but could you please repeat the name of the person who you called brilliant? I did not catch it.
Oh, right. Well, William S. Burroughs. Um, he's
Could you please maybe write it into the chat?
yeah,
I
yeah,
just
yeah,
don't know how to spell it. Thank you very much.
yeah. No problem at all. I mean, he fits your completely your definition, highly controversial and unshareable. Um, but there are others too, and I mentioned him because he happens to come to mind really. But I think we have to be careful about also thinking about writing and whether it's just creating a spectacle and whether it's actually, shock. I mean, I detect the real question underneath yours is about shock, and that is quite a difficult area, to kind of get into and think about, because you can be shocking in a way that is useful because you suddenly think, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about that before. I hadn't thought about the consequences of some particular action. But there's also just the sort of shocking spectacle where you're really just drawing attention to yourself by writing in a way which is yeah, ostensibly shocking. It's a really difficult,
Thank you. Okay.
yeah, it's a
Okay.
really difficult balance to get,
Well, thank you so much, Tom. That was really, really insightful and
Thank
useful. And
you.
I feel like we sort of covered an awful lot of very useful stuff in a relatively short time. And we sorry for keeping you longer than originally
right?
arranged. But
Yeah.
yeah. So
Well, the fireworks are starting to go off here. I can tell. I can hear them.
oh, okay. Well, are you going to go and enjoy them at some point? Are you going to go out and no?
No, no. It's a very ambiguous celebration.
Oh, okay.
Bulgarian Liberation Day is thanks to the Russians invading in
Ah,
1878. So it's a little bit
yeah.
ambiguous.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, have a quiet evening then,
Yes.
whatever you might do. And it would be great to have you back, and to
Yeah, sure.
chat to these
Yeah,
guys
anytime.
at some point. Because I feel like there's lots more we definitely could talk about. And
Yeah. Well, if any of you here, any of you students want to contact me or ask a further question, just get in touch with Tom, and I'd be
brilliant.
more than happy. Yeah.
It's very kind of you, Tom, and I'm obviously
No,
happy
no
to
problem.
connect people with you. Great stuff. All right. Thanks a lot then, Tom. Bye.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having me.
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night. Good night.
Good night.